"I'm taking half your millions, including your grandmother's estate," Preston announced with a smug grin, his voice echoing through the courtroom, as if he were announcing lottery numbers. The sheer arrogance in his tone made my stomach churn, but I forced myself to remain composed in my seat at the defendant's table. "My name is Evelyn Sinclair. I'm 45 years old, and I never in a million years imagined I'd be sitting in a divorce court right here in Charlotte, North Carolina, watching my husband of 5 years try to steal everything I had, worked for my entire life." Preston was sitting across the room with his attorney acting like he had already won the lottery. His expensive suit, the one I paid for, of course, was flawlessly pressed, and his golden hair was slicked back in that way that used to charm me but now just made me want to gag. "Your Honor," Preston's attorney droned on, "my client is entitled to half of all marital assets, including the rather substantial inheritance Mrs. Sinclair received during the course of their marriage." The lawyer's briefcase was overflowing with documents, each one outlining how Preston planned to waltz away with my grandmother's hard-earned money. I watched as the courtroom spectators leaned forward in their seats, clearly fascinated by what they assumed would be a truly massive financial settlement. Some of them were probably already doing the mental math, trying to figure out just how much Preston was going to walk away with. There were even a few reporters who'd shown up, lured in by the whispers of a multi-million-dollar divorce case involving a prominent Charlotte businesswoman. Judge Barrett, a stern woman in her 60 seconds with steel-gray hair, was reviewing the initial paperwork with a completely neutral expression. She'd been presiding over family court for over 20 years, so I figured she'd seen every dirty trick in the book. But something deep down told me she hadn't seen what I was about to reveal. Preston swiveled slightly in his chair to give me what he clearly thought was a victorious smirk. The unmitigated gall of it made my blood boil. This was the same man who used to bring me coffee in bed, who swore up and down that he loved me for who I was, not what I had. 5 years of marriage, and it had all been a complete and utter lie. The courtroom felt incredibly oppressive, with its dark wood paneling and the heavy weight of legal proceedings hanging in the air. Outside, I could faintly hear the sounds of Charlotte traffic. Just people going about their normal lives while mine was being dissected in front of complete strangers. I gripped my purse tighter, feeling the envelope inside that was about to change everything. "Mrs. Sinclair," Judge Barrett addressed me directly. "Do you have any response to these claims?" I stood up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, but my resolve stronger than ever. This was the moment I had been waiting for. The moment when Preston's insatiable greed would finally catch up with him. "Your Honor, I believe there's something the court needs to see." Looking back on it, I should have seen the warning signs much earlier in our relationship. Preston had totally swept me off my feet during a particularly vulnerable time in my life. I just turned 40 and was running my consulting firm, Apex Strategic Solutions, with a bit of success but absolutely no time for romance. My grandmother had been my closest friend and confidant until her passing 3 years before I even met Preston, and I was still very much grieving her loss when he showed up at a business conference down in Atlanta. He was charming, attentive, and seemed genuinely interested in my work, helping small businesses optimize their operations. "You're brilliant," he'd always say, watching me pore over financial reports. "I've never met anyone who understands numbers the way you do." At the time, I honestly thought he was impressed by my intelligence. Now I realized he was probably just calculating my net worth. Our courtship was a complete whirlwind of expensive dinners and romantic getaways. Preston worked as a sales manager for a pharmaceutical company, but he always seemed to have money to burn on lavish dates. "I believe in investing in the people I care about," he would say whenever I questioned his spending habits. I was flattered by his attention, and his generosity, completely clueless that he was already plotting his long-term investment strategy. When Preston proposed just 8 months later, I was hesitant. My grandmother had always warned me about men who moved too fast, but Preston was incredibly persistent. "Life's too short to wait," he kept insisting. "I know what I want, and I want you." His proposal was something out of a movie, a private dinner on a riverboat with a string quartet playing all of our favorite songs. The ring was absolutely stunning, probably worth more than his annual salary, though that's something I didn't really think about at the time. My attorney, Penelope Thorne, had strongly suggested a prenuptial agreement. "Any successful businesswoman needs to have some protection," she explained to me. "It's not exactly romantic, but it's definitely practical." I'd felt super awkward even bringing it up with Preston, worried that he'd think I didn't trust him or that I cared more about money than I did about love. But Preston's reaction actually surprised me. He just laughed and waved it off like it was no big deal. "Of course, darling. Whatever makes you feel comfortable. I'm not marrying you for your money. I'm marrying you for times you asterisk." He signed the papers without even bothering to read them, joking that love doesn't need fine print. His casual attitude completely convinced me that my worries were completely unfounded. "It's just a romantic formality," he'd said, scribbling his signature with a flourish like it was just another promise to love, honor, and cherish, but with even more legal jargon. I remember feeling relieved that he was so understanding, so willing to put all of my concerns at ease. Penelope had been incredibly thorough in drafting the agreement, making sure to protect not just my existing assets, but any future inheritance or business growth as well. "Your grandmother's estate will eventually come to you," she'd reminded me. "This ensures that it stays in your family where it truly belongs." At the time, I really thought she was being overly cautious. Now I realized that she had been absolutely prescient. The real shocker came about 18 months into our marriage when I got the call about my grandmother's estate. She'd left me absolutely everything. Her house, her investments, her collection of rare books, and a cool $2.8 million in carefully managed funds. It was far more than I had ever expected in my wildest dreams, and the inheritance completely transformed my financial situation overnight. Preston's reaction to the news should have been a major red flag, though I completely missed the significance of it at the time. His eyes literally lit up when I told him about the money. $2.8 million, he'd repeated, like he couldn't quite believe it. "Evelyn, we're rich." The way he emphasized the word "we're" should have been my first clue that something was off. From that moment forward, Preston's spending habits took a dramatic turn for the worse. He quit his job within just 6 months, claiming he wanted to explore new opportunities and be there to support my success. What he actually did was spend my money like it was his own personal allowance. He bought himself a luxury car supposedly for networking purposes. He invested in a friend's restaurant without even bothering to consult me and then lost $30,000 when the business went belly up within a year. He booked outrageously expensive vacations, joined an exclusive golf club, and started dressing like he'd been wealthy his entire life. Every single time I questioned a purchase, he'd just remind me that we're partners and that couples should always trust each other when it came to financial decisions. The breaking point finally came 6 months ago, when I found out that Preston had been telling people at the country club that the inheritance was family money that belonged to both of us. He'd even started introducing himself as some kind of hotshot investor and entrepreneur, conveniently neglecting to mention that all of his investments were being made with my grandmother's carefully preserved wealth. When I confronted him about his lies and his reckless spending, Preston got defensive and then just turned plain cruel. "You act like it's some big secret that I married up," he snapped at me. "Everyone knows you needed someone like me to actually enjoy life. Before we met, you were just a lonely workaholic with no social life." His words really cut deep because there was a grain of truth to them. I had times been lonely, and Preston had times brought excitement and companionship into my life. But I finally realized that he'd been playing the long game all along, positioning himself as my savior while systematically planning to claim everything that I'd inherited. The absolute final straw came when I stumbled across emails between Preston and his attorney discussing their divorce strategy. They'd been planning this for months, carefully timing it to maximize his potential settlement. Preston had even researched North Carolina's divorce laws, trying to find ways to argue that his emotional support and lifestyle contributions entitled him to a much larger share of my assets. That's when I finally contacted Penelope again and filed for divorce myself. I absolutely refused to let Preston control the narrative or the timeline. If he wanted to fight over my grandmother's money, I was more than ready to give him one. But it definitely wasn't going to go the way he expected. Now, standing here in this courtroom, I was completely ready to show Preston and everyone else exactly what his greed had earned him. I reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope that Penelope had so carefully prepared for this exact moment. The courtroom was completely silent, except for the soft rustle of paper and the distant hum of the air conditioning system. Preston's confident expression faltered slightly as he watched me approach the judge's bench. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear, "I believe the court needs to review this document before proceeding with any asset division discussions." Judge Barrett extended her hand and accepted the envelope. "What is the nature of this document, Mrs. Sinclair?" "It's a prenuptial agreement, Your Honor. One that my husband signed before our marriage 5 years ago." The change in the courtroom atmosphere was immediate and electric. Preston's attorney, a thin man named Arthur Finch, shot up from his chair like he'd been stung by a bee. "Your Honor, we were not made aware of any prenuptial agreement. This is highly irregular. Sit down, Mr. Finch," Judge Barrett commanded, already breaking the seal on the envelope. "I'll examine the documents and determine their validity." I went back to my seat, keeping my eyes locked on Preston. His face had gone from completely confident to confused, to something that was getting pretty close to panic in the span of about 30 seconds. He was whispering frantically to his attorney, gesturing wildly toward the judge's bench. I could make out bits and pieces of his frantic words. "She never mentioned." And, "How is this even possible, Penelope Thorne?" My attorney remained perfectly calm right beside me. She'd been preparing for this very moment for months, making sure every single detail of our strategy was completely foolproof. "Just watch," she whispered to me with a tiny little smile. Judge Barrett was a super thorough reader, taking her time with each page of the agreement. The document was incredibly comprehensive. Penelope had made absolutely sure of that 5 years ago. It outlined exactly which assets were protected, which debts would remain completely separate, and most importantly, how any future inheritance would be handled. "This appears to be a properly executed prenuptial agreement," Judge Barrett announced after several minutes of careful review. "It's dated 6 weeks before your marriage, witnessed by 2 notaries and signed by both parties." Preston's attorney looked like he wanted to just disappear into his chair. I realized that Arthur Finch had actually filed this divorce case without even doing the most basic due diligence. He just assumed, like Preston, that the marriage was going to be a straightforward asset grab. "Your Honor," Preston suddenly stood up, his voice cracking just a bit. "I need to see that document. I don't even remember signing anything like that." The judge's eyebrows shot up at Preston's outburst. "Mr. Sinclair, please remain seated and allow your attorney to handle these proceedings." But Preston was really spiraling now, his carefully constructed confidence just completely crumbling. "Evelyn, what is this? You never told me this was some kind of legal trap." "Mr. Sinclair," Judge Barrett's voice cut through the courtroom like a whip. "You will remain silent or I will hold you in contempt. Your attorney may request to review the document through proper channels." Arthur Finch approached the bench with obvious reluctance. I watched him examine the prenuptial agreement, his face getting paler with each page. He went back to his table and started whispering urgently to Preston, who was just shaking his head in complete disbelief. The courtroom spectators were now fully engaged, sensing that something incredibly dramatic was unfolding. I could hear muffled conversations and the scratching of reporters' pens as they tried to capture every single detail of Preston's very public humiliation. "Your Honor," Arthur finally addressed the court, his voice notably lacking its earlier confidence. "My client would like to request a brief recess to review these documents more thoroughly." Judge Barrett checked her watch. "Mr. Finch, did you not conduct any discovery regarding potential prenuptial agreements before filing your asset claims?" The attorney's silence was answer enough. Preston had been so completely confident in his strategy that he had never even mentioned the possibility of a prenup to his lawyer. Arthur Finch had been completely blindsided just as much as his client. "I'll give you 10 minutes to review the document," Judge Barrett declared. "But I should definitely warn you that this appears to be a legally binding agreement that will significantly impact your client's claims." During the recess, I watched Preston and his attorney huddled in a very intense conversation near the courtroom windows. Preston's gestures were becoming more and more animated and desperate as Arthur explained the implications of the prenuptial agreement. Even from across the room, I could see the exact moment when Preston realized that his whole entire plan had completely backfired. Penelope used the time to review her own notes and to prepare for what she knew would be Preston's last-ditch attempts to challenge the agreement. "He's going to claim fraud or duress," she predicted quietly. Men like Preston always blame everyone else when their schemes fall apart. She was totally right. When court resumed, Arthur Finch immediately launched into a completely desperate legal argument. Your Honor, my client believes he was deceived about the nature of this document. Mrs. Sinclair presented it as a romantic formality, not a comprehensive asset protection agreement. Judge Barrett looked distinctly unimpressed. Mr. Finch, are you claiming that your client signed a legal document without even bothering to read it? Your Honor, my client trusted his wife to be. He believed that she was being honest about the document's scope and implications. I had to bite my tongue to keep from just bursting out laughing. Preston had always prided himself on being a shrewd businessman, someone who could read people and situations like a book. Now his attorney was actually arguing that he was too trusting and naive to understand a legal contract. The document is very clearly labeled as a prenuptial agreement, Judge Barrett observed, flipping through the pages. It includes standard warnings about seeking independent legal counsel. Did your client choose to waive that right? Arthur shuffled through his papers nervously. Yes, Your Honor. My client waived his right to independent counsel, and the document was reviewed by a notary public correct, with your client present, and confirming his identity. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Barrett turned her attention directly to Preston. Mr. Sinclair, when you signed this document, did anyone force you to do so? Were you under any kind of duress or coercion? Preston's face was red with embarrassment and anger. No, Your Honor, but I just thought it was paperwork. Evelyn made it sound like it didn't even matter. Did you read the document before signing it? The question hung in the air like a sword. Preston looked all around the courtroom as if he were desperately searching for an escape route. The silence just stretched on until it became completely uncomfortable for everyone present. Mr. Sinclair, I asked you a direct question. I skimmed it. Preston finally admitted, but Evelyn said it was just a formality. Judge Barrett's expression was a complete masterpiece of judicial disapproval. Mr. Sinclair, you signed a legal document without reading it after waiving your right to legal counsel, and now you're asking this court to invalidate it because you didn't take it seriously. The courtroom was completely silent. Even the reporters had stopped writing, completely mesmerized by Preston's very public humiliation. I felt a huge surge of satisfaction watching him squirm under the judge's scrutiny. Your Honor, Arthur made one final attempt. Perhaps we could argue that the agreement is unconscionable given the disparity in. Mr. Finch, Judge Barrett interrupted him. Have you reviewed the financial disclosures included with this prenuptial agreement? Arthur flipped through the document again, clearly searching for something he had missed. There are extensive financial disclosures here, Your Honor. Indeed there are. Mrs. Sinclair provided complete documentation of her assets, income, and expected inheritance. Your client signed acknowledgments confirming that he reviewed and understood all of the financial information. This is one of the most thorough prenuptial agreements I've seen in my 23 years on the bench. Preston looked like he was about to be sick. The golden boy who had charmed his way through life was finally facing the consequences for his actions. Judge Barrett cleared her throat and started reading directly from the prenuptial agreement, her voice carrying very clearly through the silent courtroom. Section 4, Paragraph A. All assets owned by either party prior to marriage shall remain the separate property of that party. Section 4, Paragraph B. Any inheritance received by either party during the marriage shall be considered separate property and shall not be subject to division upon divorce. Preston's face went through a whole spectrum of colors from red to white to green. He gripped the edge of his table so hard that his knuckles were completely white. That can't even be legal, he muttered loud enough for several people to hear. Section 6, Judge Barrett continued addresses spousal support. Quote, neither party shall be entitled to alimony or spousal support from the other, regardless of the length of the marriage or the disparity in income. The judge looked up from the document. This section was initialed by both parties and witnessed separately. Arthur Finch was frantically taking notes, probably trying to find any possible loophole or some kind of technicality. But Penelope had been just too thorough 5 years ago. Every single potential challenge had been fully anticipated and addressed. Your Honor, I stood up. If I may address the court, proceed Mrs. Sinclair. When I inherited my grandmother's estate 18 months ago, I consulted with my attorney about whether the inheritance was protected under the prenuptial agreement. We confirmed that it was fully covered under Section 4, Paragraph B. The inheritance has been kept in separate accounts and has never been commingled with marital assets. This was definitely the final nail in Preston's coffin. Not only was the prenup ironclad, but I had been scrupulously careful about keeping the inheritance completely separate. There was absolutely no way for him to claim any portion of it. Judge Barrett nodded approvingly. Mrs. Sinclair, did you use any portion of your inheritance for marital expenses or joint purchases? No, Your Honor. I maintained my regular income for all household expenses. The inheritance has remained completely separate. Preston just exploded. That's not even true. She bought things for us. She paid for vacations. Mr. Sinclair, Judge Barrett's voice was ice cold. You are out of order. Sit down immediately. But Preston was way beyond reason now. His carefully constructed facade had just completely crumbled. She trapped me, Preston shouted. She made me think we were partners. She let me believe that money was ours, Mr. Crawford. If you cannot control yourself, I will have the bailiff remove you from my courtroom. The threat of being physically removed finally got through Preston's rage. He sat down heavily, his chest heaving with angry breaths, but the damage was already done. Everyone in the courtroom had seen his true character. The greedy, entitled man who had married me for my money, and then had the complete audacity to act like a victim when his whole plan failed. Judge Barrett reviewed the final pages of the prenuptial agreement with deliberate care. The tension in the room was almost palpable, as everyone waited for her ruling. I felt a calm satisfaction settling over me. After months of Preston's manipulation and his lies, the truth was finally coming to light. Based on my review of this prenuptial agreement, Judge Barrett announced I am ready to render my decision on asset division. Judge Barrett took off her reading glasses and looked directly at Preston with an expression that could have frozen fire. Mr. Sinclair, this prenuptial agreement is valid, comprehensive, and legally binding. You are entitled to exactly times nothing, times from your wife's premarital assets, inheritance, or business holdings. The words just hit Preston like physical blows. His mouth fell open, and he just stared at the judge in complete disbelief. Nothing, he whispered. Nothing, Judge Barrett confirmed. Furthermore, according to Section 7 of this agreement, all debts incurred individually by either party remain the responsibility of that party. Mrs. Sinclair, do you have documentation of debts incurred solely by your husband? Penelope handed me a thick folder which I then passed to the bailiff. Yes, Your Honor. Credit card debts, the car loan, the failed restaurant investment, and country club fees, all totaling approximately $87,000. Preston's attorney looked like he wanted to disappear completely. The case he had thought would net him a substantial fee had turned into a complete and utter disaster. Mr. Sinclair, Judge Barrett continued, not only will you receive no assets from this marriage, but you remain personally responsible for $87,000 debt that you accumulated during the marriage. The courtroom just erupted in murmurs and whispers. I could hear someone behind me stifle a laugh. Preston had gone from expecting millions to facing bankruptcy in the span of just 30 minutes. Your Honor, Preston's voice was barely audible. This can't be right. 5 years of marriage has to count for something. Judge Barrett's smile was razor sharp. It does count for something, Mr. Sinclair. It counts as a very expensive lesson in reading legal documents before you sign them. The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom like a clap of thunder. The court grants the divorce petition filed by Mrs. Sinclair. No assets shall be transferred to Mr. Sinclair. All individual debts remain with the party who incurred them. This court is adjourned. Preston just sat there in stunned silence as the reality of his situation finally sank in. He'd spent 5 years positioning himself for this very moment only to discover that his whole entire plan had been doomed from the day he casually signed that prenuptial agreement without even bothering to read it. People started filing out of the courtroom, but I remained seated watching Preston's world just collapse all around him. Arthur Finch was already packing his briefcase, clearly eager to escape from this professional embarrassment. Several reporters approached me for comment, but Penelope intercepted them with practiced efficiency. Evelyn Preston called. "We need to talk about this. This isn't over," he blurted out as I finally turned to leave. I stopped and faced him one last time. "Preston, it was over the instant you decided to marry me for my money instead of actually loving me for who I am. The prenuptial agreement didn't ruin your little plan. Your own greed did." His face just crumpled as the absolute weight of his entire situation finally crashed down on him. No inheritance, 0 assets, and a mountain of crushing debt that would haunt him for years and years. The guy who had always managed to charm his way through life had finally stumbled into a mess that couldn't be smoothed over with sweet talk or clever manipulation. As I walked toward those courtroom doors with Penelope right there beside me, I felt lighter than I had in what seemed like forever. The whole nightmare was finally over, and Preston's true colors had been exposed for everyone to see and judge. Justice, as it turns out, can sometimes be served with its own sense of poetic irony. Preston's life completely unraveled in the months that followed our divorce. The $87 0 inches debt forced him into declaring bankruptcy in less than 6 months, which absolutely destroyed his credit rating and made it basically impossible for him to even maintain a semblance of his former lifestyle. His reputation in Charlotte's business community was utterly ruined when word got around about how he tried to steal his wife's inheritance. He became a cautionary tale that people whispered about when discussing prenuptial agreements and all the dangers of marrying someone just for their money. The country club revoked his membership when he couldn't keep up with paying his dues, and his luxury car was repossessed by the bank, leaving him completely dependent on public transportation to get around. His dating life just vanished as women in our social circles heard all about his gold-digging scheme and started warning each other about the charming man who saw marriage as nothing more than a cold business transaction. He was forced to move back in with his elderly parents in Atlanta and take some low-level entry sales job. All his dreams of living off my grandmother's money were replaced by the harsh reality of starting over at the age of 47 with absolutely nothing but a mountain of debt and a badly damaged reputation. I used a portion of my protected inheritance money to establish the Sinclair Foundation, which provides legal assistance to women who are seeking prenuptial agreements and divorce representation. I wanted to make sure that other women wouldn't fall victim to financial predators and users like Preston. Looking back on my journey from a trusting and naive wife to an empowered divorcee, I realized that my grandmother's wisdom about protecting family wealth had actually saved me from a lot more than just financial loss. It had saved me from wasting a lifetime being used by someone who saw my love as nothing more than a quick and easy pathway to a life of easy money and luxury.